point where we think grace means, oh, all the bad I've done is wiped away, now I can do what I want. And instead of realizing what it costs God to forgive us and what God's expectations of obedience for us are, and respond to that forgiveness. What I like about Clayton King's video is he maps out, part of our struggle, part of our challenge. What does our culture say is the most important thing for you to do? Realize for yourself your dreams. Put your life's focus on you. And more than that, it says what you should be after is pursuing the things of your heart's desire. And puts a heavy emphasis on things. Puts a heavy emphasis on accumulating things so that you feel safe, secure, and are rich. Or in other words, so that you can protect what you have. With the subtle emphasis being what you have is the most important thing. I was enamored by a movie that caught fire a few years back that was dealing with what's called the bucket list. And what the movie was is, what's your bucket list of things you want to do? And I thought, well, that's interesting, creating a list of the things you want to do, except that every bucket list I've encountered has been a list of, here's what I want to experience, here's where I want to go, here's what I want to eat, here's what I want to do, and realize what are most of our bucket lists. List about me. I've never encountered a bucket list that said, you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to take everything I've got, sell it off, and make a difference in a bunch of people's lives. Or, you know what, I want to volunteer I got a year left before I'm going to die. I'm going to volunteer as many hours of each day as I can to helping out other people. I've not seen any of those bucket lists. But what I have seen is, I want to drive in this, I want to ride on that, I want to go see this. But that's our culture. And what Clayton maps out in that little plug for his book is an interesting thing. He says, what does Jesus ask for us, from us, of us? And how does God see where true living comes from? Is true living experiencing and realizing our bucket list? Or is true living, as Clayton says, when we learn to love God with all that we are, and we learn to love other people, our neighbors? And he argued in that little clip that where we truly come alive is when we actually set aside our sin, our self, and focus on others. Which for me is really difficult because I am caught in the world of myself. And I'm caught in the world of wanting to take care of myself. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge in many ways. And it creeps in on us in ways we don't expect. I see it as a parent, where it's real easy to cross that line. Do I care about the well-being of my kids, or do I care about my kids because of how they reflect upon me? Being a soccer ref, I've seen many games where I clearly saw parents who saw their kids in sports for themselves, not for their kids. You really see it in sports. You really see it in the politics of sports in our high schools. It's fascinating. And you can see it in other places too. It's a fine line between parenting for the well-being of your kids and parenting so that your kids reflect good on you. And when I'm parenting where they're reflecting good on me, I'm sinning. And I know I'm parenting as a sinner. It's hard to be focused on parenting for them. It's hard to be focused on sharing ourselves with others. It's easier to be focused on sharing ourselves with us. I like to tell myself, Jesus was asked, what are the most important understandings of the law? And he said, love God with all that you are, love your neighbor as yourself, which implies loving yourself. Well, I think I love myself, but I'm starting to grow in understanding that maybe I don't really love myself. Maybe I'm afraid of losing what I have. And so I call my loving of self, or that fear of loving of self, and then do all kinds of things to keep me feeling safe and secure and protected, where I'm not really loving myself. I'm just afraid of losing what I have. That's why when you hear this passage that Jesus says, this is, a string of him saying some really uncomfortable things. To me, this passage is Jesus walking up to his followers. He's not talking to strangers. He's talking to his followers. for the closest to less close followers, but followers, people who are wanting to build their life off of how he's living his life. And he basically walks up to them and kind of slaps them in the face in this passage. And he says, I want you to be very awake, very alert, and very understanding of what I am challenging you to do and be in following me. And he does that in a way that we usually, we kind of take for granted, but he does it when he says, whoever comes to me and does not hate. That's not a soft word. Does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Now, there's a context that he's doing this in. And the context that he's doing this in is first century Palestine. And he's in a Jewish community talking to Jewish followers. None of these are Gentiles. And it's a community that is struggling to maintain itself as being Israel when they're under captivity of Rome. But not only that, less than 100 years ago was the Maccabean revolts, where Jewish militants tried to recapture the temple and tried to reestablish Israel's freedom in spite of being under Roman rule. And the Roman army came in and slaughtered them all and re-put them under enslavement. And so what was now going on is how do we maintain our identity against the Roman Empire that really, really doesn't like us and want us to be here. And what became the focal point was family. Everything began to center around family. And not just family. We don't think of family quite this way. And part of what family was about is, I as a father, my job is to make sure my sons would all become ministers and be ministers equal equality to me or better than me. And to help them have kids so that all their male sons would become ministers as well. Or if I was a baker, my job was to make sure my kids became equal or better bakers. And if any of my kids wanted to do anything other than become a baker, that is rebelling against family. That's disobedience. That's disrespect. That's throwing tradition out. That's throwing family out. And so Jesus is in a world where the focus was so centered on family to maintain what it meant to be Jewish in this Roman occupation that they had become super focused on that family. So simply to follow Jesus cost you. To follow Jesus could lose your relationship with your family. They may not talk to you anymore for having done it. And so here, nearing the end of his 3 years of ministry, he's approaching Jerusalem finally, having an idea what's going to happen to him. He turns to his disciples and says, look, you need to get what's being asked of you. That God comes before all other things. Loving God and neighbor comes over family. Is he meaning we ditch family, we stop loving family? No, because Jesus talks in other places about it's assumed you should always be loving your family, forgiving your family, being forgiven by your family, building those relationships. But that's a given because even ungodly people do that. What matters to Jesus is do you get the cost of what's being asked and the demand that God is making on us. In other words, God isn't saying to just, simply be an obsessive fan. This is kind of the kickoff Sunday where football is kicking off, fall routines are kicking off, and you can look at football and you can say, well, are there football disciples? Not really. There's fanatics, there's fans of every level, but are they really disciples? I mean, there are people I've encountered who can watch a play and say what defense is being called and what offense they think is being called. They've studied football that much. But does that studying of football affect who they are as a person in relationship to other people? Is it life-changing, or is it like knowing how to quilt really well? Make sense? There's a lot of football fans, but are there really football disciples? I could see someone being a disciple of Vince Lombardi when he lists off these things became the principles that guided my life and my coaching and how I related to my players. But who becomes a disciple of football? We become fans. And what Jesus is doing is he's turning to all the people who are following him, and he's basically asking, are you a fan or are you a disciple? In other words, Do you take what I'm doing and saying serious enough to realize that you need to change your life in relationship to it and continually be changing your life in relationship to it? And that's a hard thing for him to ask. And it's an uncomfortable thing for him to ask. Because what he is saying to his followers is, look, are you taking serious that God wants this new kingdom to come about? And wants the center of it to be love and forgiveness, which is going to cost us a lot in the world we live in. We're not a very loving people. We're not a very forgiving people. Clayton pointed out, we're sitting there saying, here's the most important thing, pursue self-interest and everything, pursue your own happiness, and yet we've been at a 50% divorce rate for 3 decades. You look at some of the darker sides of what's going on in our culture, you've got to wonder, how well has this putting all the focus on ourselves done for us as a people? Has it drawn us closer together? Jesus in his day is saying, I want you to be drawn closer together, but I want it to be centered on God, and I want it to be centered on love, and I want it to be centered on forgiveness. And none of those are easy things. Especially the forgiveness one. I've sat in rooms with colleagues who won't talk about sin anymore because it makes people uncomfortable. And I'm like, won't talk about sin? We need to talk about sin better. What do we need to talk about? We need to talk about all the times we don't live into the potential God made us capable of having. In our confession, if you paid attention to our confession in the worship service, it not only asks forgiveness for the things we've done, it asks forgiveness for the things we've left undone. How many times has a neighbor said something to you that opened the door for a conversation that could have been meaningful and could have grown, and you found a way to keep it shallow or cut it off? Or I didn't have the time. Someone says something, you're like, wow, that's an opening, like something's going on and they're yearning for help or something, but I'm busy. And you turn a different direction. That's the kind of stuff Jesus died for. And then what he does is he turns around and challenges us, and he's challenging these disciples, understand. I'm asking you to look at your life as being a life given to God through how you live it at every turn, at every day, at every age, at every situation. And at the center of it, are you building loving relationships with people, which isn't easy. Even within our own family, it's not always easy. I don't have the relationships with my siblings I wish I had. I have different relationships with different siblings, and some of them are better than others. And here, Jesus is turning around and challenging his followers. Look, if you really want to be a Christian, then it's going to cost. And it's about how we figure out that loving, and that forgiving, and that being forgiven, and that being loved. Sometimes it can be even harder to let someone love you than it is to try and love them. I know it's a lot harder to forgive ourselves than it is to forgive others. But Jesus is at a turning point where he's really wanting people to get it. And so he really kind of uses hyperbolic language with that hate word to slap the people around him and say, I really want you to get this. It's not about being a fan. It's about seeing who God is in your life and how God demands us to always be changing at every point in our life. And that change is to always be growing closer to other people. Always figuring out how to love and reach out and connect with other people. And that's a lot of energy. And that's a lot of work. And Jesus says, I'm looking for disciples who get it. Follow me. And the beauty is the cross is that forgiveness that empowers us to be able to do it. And that the Spirit of God that's in us gives us the strength to do it when we open ourselves up to it and allow God to work and flow and move within us. Let us be those Christians. Let us pray.